The thermal sensor array was Davan Rourke's assignment for the Keth 7 deployment, because the assessment lead had looked at the relief team's roster and determined that Davan was the person most likely to read the sensor data, rather than use it to confirm a decision already made, which was the difference between sensor operation and sensor performance, and which mattered more than most people understood until it mattered entirely. He had been on Keth 7 for 6 hours when the explosion happened, which was long enough to have the deployment's geography organized in his head. The evacuation corridors, the triage staging, the structural map he had reviewed on arrival, because reviewing structural maps on arrival was the habit of someone who had been doing disaster relief long enough to know what he needed before he needed it. The industrial complex's eastern section was on the map. The secondary processing bay was on the map. He knew where they were, and he knew what was in them because he had read the facility documentation in the 2 hours before deployment went active, which was also the habit of someone who had been doing this long enough. The cascade started at the main processing line and moved in the direction that structural weaknesses moved, along the path of least resistance and most consequence. The assessment lead called the eastern section at the 12-minute mark, which was the correct call given the data available to her, which did not include the thermal sensor data, because the thermal sensor data was with Davan and Davan was processing it. "Assessment lead," he said on the team channel. "I have a life sign in the secondary processing bay. Strong signal, stable." There was a pause of the specific quality of a pause that preceded a response. The speaker had already prepared. "Rourke, the structural integrity timeline on that section is 7 to 10 minutes. The chemical fire in the secondary bay is above the survivability threshold for all registered coalition species. Rescue is deemed impossible by Protocol 7 through Protocol 14 inclusive." "What's the signal profile on the sensor?" he said, which was not a response to what she had said, which she noted. "Rourke, I have the gear," he said. "I have the gear and I have a stable signal. What's the medical unit status?" "Staged at the primary triage area. Have them ready for burns and possible smoke inhalation," he said. "Document that I was briefed on the protocols." "Rourke, I am ordering you." "I know you are," he said. "Document that too." He had been moving toward the eastern section since the moment the signal had registered as stable rather than declining, because declining meant you were managing what was already determined and stable meant you were in a situation where the determination had not been made yet, and undetermined situations were the ones that had room in them. The door to the secondary processing bay had a warning placard that listed the thermal conditions and the chemical exposure risks and the structural integrity status, because disaster response placarding requirements were thorough, and the team that had placed it had been doing their job. He read it. It was accurate. He pushed through the door. The bay was the assessment lead's description made physical. He had been in industrial fires before, which was not the same as being prepared for this one, but was better than the alternative. The chemical fire produced a quality of heat that was different from standard combustion. Not hotter in the simple sense, but more total. The heat present in the air itself, rather than radiating from surfaces. The specific quality of an environment that had been uniformly converted into a state that biological tissue was not built for. His thermal gear was rated for the outer range of this environment, which meant it was managing the conditions rather than excluding them, which meant he was working on a timeline that the gear could track and that he was tracking. The secondary processing bay was large. The sensor had given him a position. The equipment alcove on the northeast wall, which was the alcove with the composite construction he had noted on the facility map, which had a different thermal profile than the surrounding structure, because composite construction held temperature differently than the primary materials, which was why someone in that alcove was alive when the bay was not compatible with being alive. He moved in the specific, efficient way of someone who had been trained to move in environments that wanted to kill him, not quickly in the careless sense, but quickly in the sense of moving without wasted motion, every step the step that covered the most ground with the least exposure. The structural elements were doing what the assessment lead had described. He was noting the ones that were most immediate about it and routing accordingly, which was the sensor data applied to navigation, which was the sensor data being useful. He found her in the alcove. She was low on the floor, against the composite wall, in the specific position of someone who had understood the environment and had responded to that understanding correctly. She was breathing. Her features were obscured by the soot and the specific, anonymizing quality of trauma, but she was breathing, and she was warm in the way of a living person rather than warm in the way of a fire, and the sensor was reading her signal at the same strength it had been reading it outside. He did not know who she was. This was operationally irrelevant. "I have you," he said, which was information she may or may not have been conscious enough to receive, and which he said because saying it was something rather than nothing, and something was what the situation called for. He got his arms under her. He got her upright and then across his shoulders in the carry that the training had made into muscle memory, the specific distribution of weight that allowed him to move with a person over difficult terrain in gear that was adding its own weight to the equation. He moved. The gear was doing less than it had been doing when he entered. He noted this in the operational register and kept moving. The structural elements were doing more than they had been doing when he entered. He noted this also and kept moving. The door was in the direction he was moving. The direction he was moving was toward the door. He went through the door. The outside had more people in it than he had left. He was processing the environment in the depleted, methodical way of someone who had just spent 11 minutes in a secondary processing bay, and was managing the specific transition from that environment to this one, which involved a number of physiological adjustments his body was making automatically, and that he was allowing to proceed while he moved toward the triage area, because moving toward the triage area was the next step. He noticed the transport vessels first, the specific, formal configuration of a court deployment rather than an emergency response, the kind of vessels that arrived when the people inside them required an infrastructure that ordinary emergency response did not provide. He noticed the cordon, which was the specific, practiced organization of a security arrangement rather than a disaster perimeter. He noticed the people at the center of the cordon, who had the quality of people for whom cordons were a professional courtesy rather than a physical necessity. He noticed the woman at the center of the people, who was looking at him. She was Keth. He knew the species from the colony's population documentation, the specific quality of Keth formal bearing, which was the bearing of a civilization that had organized itself around hierarchy long enough that the hierarchy was no longer a posture but a structure. She was wearing the specific quality of court formal that communicated itself even in disaster aftermath, even to a human responder who had just exited a chemical fire and was managing the transition. And she was looking at him with the absolute, focused attention of someone who had been waiting for the outcome of a specific event and was now in receipt of it. "Davan Rourke," she said, which was how she knew his name without him having provided it, which he noted. "Ma'am," he said, which was the word he used for authority figures when he did not have the specific designation, and which was apparently incorrect in some way because the court official nearest to her made a sound. "His fate was already decided," she said, "the moment he entered those flames." He looked at her. He looked at the triage area, which was approximately 20 meters to his left, and which contained the medical unit he had asked to be ready. He looked at the woman he was carrying, who was being registered by the people around him with a quality of attention that was different from the attention of people registering a disaster survivor. "I need to get her to triage," he said. "Yes," the Queen said, "you will, and then we will speak." The medical teams came forward, multiple medical teams, which he noted, with the coordinated urgency of people for whom this specific person's survival was the most significant thing currently occurring on Keth 7. He transferred her to the medical team in the specific, careful way of someone who had carried a person through a fire and was not going to be careless about the transfer. She was taken. The medical team moved quickly, and with the focused energy of people who understood exactly what their priority was. He stood in the specific, depleted state of someone who had completed the thing they came to do and was waiting for the next thing to identify itself. The court official came forward. He was a precise man with the specific quality of someone who had delivered significant information in difficult circumstances before and had developed a methodology for it. He looked at Davan's gear, which was visibly beyond its rated exposure, and at Davan's hands and forearms, which the gear had not fully covered in the final section of the transit. "You should go to the medical unit," the official said. "I was told we would speak," Davan said, indicating the direction of the Queen, who was being briefed by her security team with the composed attention of someone who was receiving the briefing and also managing something larger than the briefing. After, the official said, "Medical unit first." "What did she mean?" Davan said. His fate was already decided. The official looked at him with the expression of a man who had a thorough answer to the question and had determined that the medical unit was the appropriate venue for delivering it. After, he said again, "Please." Davan went to the medical unit. The medical team documented his burns in the clinical language of people who were noting what the fire had cost and what could be addressed and what would take time. And he lay in the treatment station and looked at the ceiling of the field medical facility and thought about what the Queen had said, which he was thinking about in the focused, methodical way of someone doing the mental work that was available while the physical work was being done by other people. The moment he entered those flames. He had entered those flames at the 4-meter mark, which was the point where the door was behind him and the bay was in front of him, and the sensor was in his hand reading a stable signal. He had entered them with his thermal gear and his training, and the specific, practical calculation of someone who had the gear, and she had a signal, and the signal was stable, and the math was not complicated. Whatever fate had been decided in that moment, he had not been consulted. The court official's name was Velkorath, and he was thorough in the way of people who had served in a position that required thoroughness for long enough that thoroughness had become their resting state. He arrived at the medical station on the second day, when the treatment team had completed the primary interventions and had assessed Davan as stable and recovering, and he sat in the chair beside the treatment bed and put a document folder on the side table and looked at Davan with the expression of someone who had organized what he was about to say and was ready to begin. "The sovereign protection law," Velkorath said, "has governed the legal status of royal preservation in the Keth Confederacy for 612 years. It has been invoked 11 times in that period. It has never been successfully challenged or overridden by any authority, including successive sovereign queens." Davan looked at the document folder. "The woman you extracted from the secondary processing bay," Velkorath said, "is Crown Heir Vale Vel Anthesora, the sovereign queen's only child and the designated successor to the Confederacy's throne." Davan looked at the ceiling. "The sovereign protection law defines the legal consequences of preserving royal bloodline through deliberate sacrifice of personal safety," Velkorath said. "The relevant provision." He opened the folder and found the page with the specific efficiency of someone who had been reviewing this document for 2 days and knew exactly where everything was. States that any individual who willfully enters a situation of significant mortal risk to preserve a member of the royal bloodline, and who succeeds in that preservation, is thereby bound to that royal as defender consort. "Define defender consort," Davan said. Velkorath told him. He told him the full definition, the historical context, the obligations on both sides, the rights and standing the designation carried, the specific legal architecture of a 600-year institution that had been designed to recognize and formalize the highest possible expression of devotional commitment that the Keth Confederacy's legal framework recognized. He delivered this with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that the person receiving the information was receiving a great deal of it and needed the time to process each section. Davan received it. When Velkorath had finished, Davan was quiet for a long time. "She can't override it," he said. "The sovereign queen cannot override the sovereign protection law," Velkorath said. "No authority can." The law was written specifically to preclude the possibility of royal intervention in its application, because the historical context of its creation included instances where royal families attempted to dissolve inconvenient bindings. The law was made irrevocable in response to those instances. So when she said my fate was already decided, she was stating a legal fact, Velkorath said, not a threat. The queen is, he paused with the pause of someone choosing language carefully. She is many things about this situation. She is not displeased that her daughter is alive. What is she about the other part? She is the sovereign queen, Velkorath said, which was a complete answer in the specific way of answers that communicated everything without specifying anything. She will speak with you when you are recovered sufficiently for the conversation. Davan looked at the document folder. "The crown heir," he said. "Does she know?" "She has been briefed," Velkorath said. "She is in the adjacent room." Davan looked at the wall between the two rooms. "Adjacency provision," Velkorath said. Section 4 of the law. Defender consort and royal are required to be in adjacent recovery until both are medically cleared. The provision exists to ensure the defender consort receives appropriate medical attention and is not separated from the protection of the royal household. He paused. It also exists, historically, because most defender consort situations involved individuals who were known to the royal, and the proximity was considered appropriate for both parties. "Your situation is different," Davan said. "The law makes no distinction," Velkorath said. "I want to be transparent about that." Davan was quiet again. He was doing the methodical work of processing information in the order that produced clarity, which was the order he always used, and which was serving him now in the specific way of a process that was reliable in difficult circumstances, because it had been built for difficult circumstances. "I would like to speak with her," he said. "When you are medically cleared," Velkorath said. "How long?" Velkorath looked at the treatment chart. "Tomorrow," he said, "if you are stable through the night, which the treatment team believes you will be." Davan nodded. He looked at the wall between the two rooms and thought about what was on the other side of it. A woman he had carried out of a fire, who was also a crown heir, who was also now legally bound to him by a law he had not known existed when he crossed the threshold of a door that the protocols had described as the last door a person went through. He thought about the sensor, the stable signal, the math that had not been complicated. He would have done it the same way. He knew this about himself in the same way he knew the things about himself that were reliable, not with performed certainty, but with the plain acknowledgement of something that had been tested and had returned a consistent result. He would have done it the same way. The law being what it was did not change that. What the law being what it was changed was what came after, which was a different question, and which he was going to need more information to think about correctly, and which he was going to get tomorrow. She was sitting in the chair when the connecting door opened. The door the adjacency provision had made relevant, which neither of them had used before now, which Davan had looked at several times in the preceding 24 hours in the specific way of a door that represented something he was not yet ready to open. He had opened it. She was Keth in the way he had not been able to assess in the secondary processing bay, which was the way of someone at rest rather than someone surviving. The specific quality of the species' formal bearing, which he had read about, and which was different from reading about it in the way that everything was different from reading about it. She was younger than he had expected, which was information the briefing documentation had not prepared him for. She had the expression of someone who had been waiting for this conversation and had prepared for it and was ready to begin. "Davan Rourke," she said. "Your Highness," he said, which was the designation Velkorath had provided. She made the slight gesture that Velkorath had told him was the Keth indicator for set the formality aside, which he did because she had asked. "Vale," she said, "given what the law has apparently determined about our relationship, the formal designation is going to become functionally complicated." "Vale," he said. She looked at him with the full, direct attention he was learning to recognize as her register for significant things. "You don't know what you did," she said. "I know what I did," he said. "I went into the building. I found you. I got you out." "You don't know what you did legally," she said. "Velkorath was thorough," he said. "He is," she said. "He told you everything. He told me the law," he said. "He told me the historical context and the definitions and the irrevocable nature of the designation. He told me you were briefed." He looked at her. "He didn't tell me what you thought about it." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, which had the specific, bandaged quality of someone whose hands had been in a fire, and then at the fire rating on his recovery chart, which was visible from the chair, and which she had apparently been looking at before he came through the door. "I was conducting a facility inspection," she said. "Unscheduled, because unscheduled inspections produce more accurate data. The cascade started while I was in the alcove. I got low and stayed low because that was the correct response and because," she paused, "because I was not ready to have it in there. I was conscious for most of it. I could hear the fire. I could hear the structure." She looked at him. "I could hear you in the last section, before you found me." "I was moving fast," he said. "You were moving like someone who had a destination," she said, "in a building that was not compatible with having destinations. The sensor had a signal," he said. "The signal was where I was going." She looked at the recovery chart again. "The assessment lead filed her incident report," she said. "She documented that you were briefed on protocols 7 through 14 and that you entered anyway. She also documented that her team's structural integrity assessment was correct. The section collapsed 4 minutes after you came through the door." She looked at him. 4 minutes. "The math was sufficient," he said. "You didn't know the math was sufficient when you went in." "I knew I had the gear and you had a stable signal," he said. "The rest was what I was going to find out." She was quiet for a long time. The medical facility was quiet in the specific way of facilities that had been doing significant work and had reached the interval between the work and the next thing, the ambient quality of a place that had processed something large and was continuing on. "The sovereign protection law," she said. "I've been reading the historical record, all 11 previous instances." She looked at the document folder that Velkorath had apparently provided to both of them. "In every previous instance, the person bound by the law knew the person they were entering the situation for. In every previous instance, the binding was the formalization of something that already existed. The defender consort chose the situation because they had already chosen the person." "I know," he said. "You didn't choose me," she said. "You chose to go into a building because a sensor had a stable signal." "Yes," he said. "The law makes no distinction," she said. "Velkorath was clear about that." "What do you—" She stopped. She was doing the thing he had been watching her do since the conversation started, which was the thing of someone who had prepared extensively for a conversation and was discovering that the preparation had addressed the wrong variables. "What do you want to do with this?" she said. He thought about it in the honest way. He thought about the situation in the order it had happened. The sensor, the signal, the door, the fire, the 11 minutes, the emergence, the Queen's declaration, Velkorath's thorough briefing, the 24 hours of processing in the adjacent room with the connecting door he had not yet opened. He thought about what the situation contained, which was a law he had not known and a person he had not met, and a designation that was irrevocable and a woman who had stayed alive in an alcove, while the fire did what the fire did, and who had been prepared for this conversation, and had been asking him the question he had been asking himself. "I don't know enough yet," he said, "to know what I want to do with it." He looked at her. I know what I did and why. I know the law is what it is. I know you didn't choose this either." He paused. "I think what I want to do is learn what I don't know, if that's something you're willing to be part of." She looked at him. The full, direct attention, the one that was her register for things she was taking seriously. He was learning to read it as a fixed point, the expression that arrived when she had decided to be precise about something. "I told my mother," she said, "that I would not hold you to a law you invoked without knowledge of its consequences." "Velkorath told me," he said. "What did she say?" "She said the law does not ask what you knew when you crossed the threshold," she said. "She said the law asks what you did." She paused. "She also said," she looked at the fire rating on the chart again. "She said that in 1200 years of her family's history, the people bound by the sovereign protection law had been bound because they chose someone above their own survival. She said the law has never been wrong about what that meant. She said she had no authority to override it and that she was not certain she would if she did." Davan looked at the chart. He looked at his hands, which had been in the fire. "What did you say?" he said. "I said I needed to speak with you," she said, "before I said anything else." "And now you have," he said. "And now I have," she said. They were quiet for a moment in the way of two people who have said the significant things and are sitting with them. In a medical facility on a colony world where the fire was out, and the structure was stable, and the sensor array was back in its storage case, and the math had turned out to be sufficient. "I would like to know what the situation means," she said, "before either of us decides what to do with it. The law, the history, the obligations on both sides, what the designation has meant for the people who held it before." She looked at him. "And I would like to know who you are, not the incident report, not the sensor data, who you are." "I would find that useful," he said, "all of it." "I'll have Velkorath prepare the historical documentation," she said. "He will be thorough." "He was," Davan said. "He always is," she said, with the specific, dry warmth of someone describing a quality they had relied on for a long time and found consistently valuable. "And I would like to tell you about the inspection," she said. "What I was looking for and what I found before the cascade. It's relevant to the facility's safety record, and I haven't been able to complete the report because the report requires my testimony, and my testimony is—" She paused. "It is available. I simply haven't been in the condition to give it formally. You were in the facility. You may have observations that are relevant." He looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression that was not the formal register, and was not the preparing for a conversation register, but something else. Something that existed on the other side of the briefings, and the historical documentation, and the law's irrevocable provisions, which was simply the expression of one person talking to another person about what they had both been through and what they were going to do about it. "I have observations," he said. "Good," she said. "Tell me." He told her about the facility map. He told her about the structural documentation he had reviewed and what it had, and had not told him about the cascade's likely origin point. He told her about the sensor reading and the specific quality of the signal that had made the math straightforward rather than uncertain. She listened and asked the questions that were the right questions, and he answered them, and she told him about the inspection, the data she had been gathering, the discrepancy she had identified in the maintenance records, the reason the alcove had been her specific location when the cascade happened, which was that the alcove had the composite construction whose thermal profile she had been documenting as part of the safety assessment. "The composite construction is what kept you alive," he said. "I knew it was a significant outlier in the thermal data," she said. "I did not know how significant until I was inside it." "You filed a report before the inspection," he said, noting the composite section's thermal profile. "Standard pre-inspection documentation," she said. "Yes." "That report is going to be important," he said, "for the facility investigation. You documented the anomaly before the explosion. That establishes the timeline." She looked at him. "You're thinking about the investigation." "I'm thinking about the report," he said. The report is how the documentation is useful. The documentation being useful is why you were doing the inspection. She was quiet for a moment. You went into a fire, she said. You have burns that are going to require weeks of recovery. You are legally bound to a crown heir you had never met, and you are thinking about the facility investigation report. The report is what makes the inspection matter, he said. You were in that building for a reason. The reason should be in the record. She looked at him for a long time, the full attention, the precise register. Yes, she said, it should. Outside the medical facility, Keth 7 was doing what Colony Worlds did after significant events. Continuing. The work of continuation more urgent than the pause for assessment. The ore deposit still there, and the extraction still required, and the ordinary life of a settlement organized around what it was organized around, persisting in the specific way of things that persisted regardless. The fire was out. The secondary processing bay was a documented loss. The facility's safety record was under investigation by the Colonial Standards Authority, which had received a preliminary report from the Crown Heir's office via Velkorath, who had been thorough about it. The Sovereign Queen was in the colony's